you very much, Ross, for the very interesting presentation. I guess everyone here is having a reminiscence as your presentation has successfully brought our memories back to the 1997 and 1998. So we will begin the question and answer session. So before we begin, please introduce yourself if anyone wants to raise a question. So yes, first question, please. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Pak. Very interesting paper. My name is Yoga Avandi. I come from Bank Indonesia. During the crisis, I just joined the Bank Indonesia, so please don't blame me. Okay, I have actually 3 points to raise to discuss with Pak Melia. The first one is in the first page. You mentioned that Indonesia is in 1997, 1998, the OP was very healthy. I think we should be reminded that at that time the current account was in a deficit for a long time, I think around 3 to 4%. And then also the fact that foreign borrowing at that time was not controllable. In fact, there was no data at that time. So we had this government foreign borrowing, but the private foreign borrowing we didn't have any idea at that time. So I think your conclusion about this, the fact that Indonesia's BOP was very healthy, I think I should ask you about it, because you see, if you look at for example, the net international investment position in IIP, I think at that time the foreign liabilities of all entities in Indonesia is higher than the assets. So I think I don't think the BOP at that time was very healthy. The second point that I would like to ask is about the CDS itself, related to the fact that you said that with 19 billion hard currency in the reserve, then it can cover the base money. But if you look at this, the fact that Indonesia had a huge foreign borrowing at that time, I think here the Financial Times said that it was like about 157 billion. But would that create another problem? Because if you say that you set the exchange rate value only to 3,000, then it will create a huge demand for the reserve to cover the balance sheet. I'm saying it's not about the base money balance sheet, but about the off balance sheet, which is the contingent liabilities of the Indonesia at that time. And the third point is coming back here, because I think in the last page you said that Indonesia is, Indonesia is currently have a single nominal anchor. So I think looking at this time, I think Bank Indonesia has already adopted the inflation targeting. I would like to ask you about this, because I think it's important for us to be disciplined on it, and then we keep the currency float. So we keep the exchange rate to insulate the economy instead of the source of shocks, as the exchange rate can be dreadful to the economy. So what do you suggest about this current situation? Because if you look at the 2013 last year, during the taper contract, I think Bank Indonesia has managed to insulate the economy quite well. So, but I think the pressure to give the exchange rate more rigid, I think is high. So please give me your recommendation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pak Yoga. There's some very interesting questions there. First of all, as I did indeed say, that the balance of payments was very strong prior to the Asian financial crisis, and I demonstrated that by looking at the level of international reserves, and this is what I mean by strong. The international reserves, for what's that, 6 months or so, maybe a bit more before the crisis, were increasing very rapidly. What this means is there was indeed a current account deficit, let me start out by saying that I don't see the current account deficit as a problem. There are countries in this world that have quite high current account deficits for years and years and years and years. For example, if you look at Singapore, I seem to remember that it had current account deficit of at least 5%, maybe more, for many, many years. It's not a problem provided that you have capital inflow to match the current account deficit. The balance of payments is, of course, simply the sum of the current account and the capital account. And if I look at this graph here, which shows international reserves increasing so rapidly prior to the crisis, even though the current account was in deficit, you're telling me 3 or 4%, then that tells me that the capital account, capital inflow, was even higher than that. So that's what I call a balance of payments healthy. It's not actually a very good term. It was a surplus balance of payments at that time. It's true that Bank Indonesia didn't have data on all foreign borrowing at the time, but you don't need that data. All you need to know is that the balance of payments is in surplus. That means we're measuring the current account deficit. If the balance of payments is in surplus, that means that the capital account is bigger than that. And to me, that's a very strong balance of payments position. But, okay, let's look at that a little bit further. I would argue that in those circumstances, Bank Indonesia should have allowed the exchange rate to appreciate more. It shouldn't have forced it to continue to depreciate. At that time, the exchange rate was depreciating, and if you think about it, that's crazy. If your international reserves are increasing, you really should be appreciating, not depreciating. So it means that Bank Indonesia was in the market buying foreign exchange all the time. That means that it's keeping the price of foreign exchange artificially high. Right? Now, what's the effect of doing that? For Bank Indonesia to buy foreign exchange, it has to pay for that by issuing base money. That's the way it goes. That's what the transaction is. If you're Bank Indonesia and I sell foreign exchange to you, you have to give me rupiah base money in exchange for that. Okay? So that meant that the supply of base money was also increasing quite rapidly at that time. And that would have been a problem because increasing money supply tends to cause inflation. But Bank Indonesia also had an inflation target at that time. The inflation target was actually about 5%, maximum of 5%. In practice, the inflation was always closer to 10%. Well, why? It's because the base money supply was just increasing too rapidly. Bank Indonesia during that period was issuing some SBIs, which to do that, it had to keep the interest rate reasonably high. But if you keep the interest rate reasonably high, then you encourage people to borrow offshore, and so you get more capital inflow. You get more capital inflow, you get more foreign exchange reserves, you have to buy them out, that increases base money. So it's going round and round in circles. So if you look at the balance sheet of Bank Indonesia back at that time, you find that its SBIs were increasing on the liability side, and its foreign exchange reserves were increasing on the asset side. Foreign exchange reserves, it means something like US Treasuries. The yield might have been 6%, might have been less than 6%. If you look at the SBIs, the cost of those might have been 12%. I'm just trying to remember from a long time ago. But there's clearly a negative spread between Bank Indonesia's assets and its liabilities. And not only is there a negative spread, but the position is getting bigger and bigger over time because this process is just a sort of non-equilibrium process. It's just getting worse and worse. And so the private sector is able to comprehend this, and it's able to look at Bank Indonesia and say, well, Bank Indonesia's profitability has got to be falling, or it's got to be negative. And Bank Indonesia's directors won't like this because they get bonuses every year, and the bonuses depend on the size of Bank Indonesia's profit. So something's got to give. This cannot go on forever. And so if you have this combination of policies, an inflation target, which you're sort of trying to meet, but you're also preventing the rupiah from appreciating because you have a depreciation target, then these two nominal anchors are incompatible. Eventually that will break down, and it did. So that's kind of in response to your first question. You didn't need data on foreign borrowing. All you needed to do was to observe what's happening to international reserves, what's happening to SBIs, what's happening to base money. You look at those three things in combination, you realise you've got a problem, and the problem because you have incompatible policy objectives. The second question was about about whether the currency board could have succeeded with an exchange rate of something like 3,000, for example. And I said that there were enough reserves to cover base money at that time. You drew attention to the fact that Indonesia had a whole lot of foreign debt at the time. I think you mentioned the amount of $137 billion. Well, under a currency board, that figure is kind of irrelevant because anybody who has foreign borrowings has to find foreign exchange to pay off those borrowings. And you can buy that foreign exchange from the currency board, but in order to do so, you have to have base money. And as I say, at that time, there was only about 60 trillion rupiah of base money in existence. So regardless of the fact that you have all this foreign debt to repay, before you can buy foreign exchange from the currency board, you need to get hold of base money. Where are you going to get the base money from? You can only get it from other people in the private sector. So that is the logic of the currency board. It doesn't matter how much foreign debt there is. You either have to get it from the currency board or you get it from the market. Imagine if all of those people tried to repay their foreign debt at the same time. Well, I guess that's the point in a way. That doesn't need to happen. If everybody has confidence that the currency board exchange rate is going to stick, then they don't need to pay off their foreign debt immediately. I mean, when they borrowed, they didn't intend to repay it the next day. There's a loan repayment schedule. There's probably an expectation of being able to roll over the debt at the end of that period. So it's kind of unrealistic to say, what about this $137 billion of debt? It's kind of like saying everybody wants to repay it at the same day. Well, they don't. And if they did and they tried to do so, then you remember what the balance sheet of the currency board looks like. It's only got foreign exchange reserves on the asset side, it's got base money on the liability side. Every time somebody tries to buy some foreign exchange reserves, this goes down, but so does this. And this amount is always less than this amount. Right? So that means that everybody who wants to repay their foreign debt is going to be fighting to get rupiah. Right? So short-term interest rates will rise very greatly. And when the short-term interest rates rise, then there's more incentive to bring in foreign capital and not to repay your debt. It's going to be very expensive for you to repay your foreign debt. And so that's why the markets greeted the currency board proposal so positively. Can we find that graph? Remember, the currency board is being talked about during this period here, and the markets, they weren't worried about what you were saying. On the contrary, they thought, this is great, and I think the exchange rate is going to be way down here. So the problem you're talking about is not really a problem at all. And in any case, if the currency board proposal had been adopted, remember that there's that 1 month transition period in which the market sets the rate. It's not determined in advance. You allow market forces to determine the rate. And if everybody's had 1 month to get used to the idea and to trade to their heart's content, then at the end of that 1 month, then that's the rate. It's the equilibrium rate. There's no reason for
Can I
it.
say?
You, sure, man. Go ahead.
How about the fact that, if you have this, the balance sheet is, I know the base money, you have the M1 and 2.
Yeah.
Yes, the money supply for this money.
Yeah.
And you have this third party liabilities, right, the rupiah or banking system. Same, all the rupiah in the third money, like the saving deposit, currency deposit.
Yeah. Well, that's in
So, how about the fact that the people at that time want to
maybe it's being recorded.
so we have this, M2 balance sheets,
Yeah.
and then at that balance sheet we have this third party deposits, right?
Yeah.
And then at that time, say you already set 3,000 rupiah for $1. And
The
then
market said that.
market said it. And then would that encourage people to kind of convert the third party deposit into you don't have to have currency right at that time. You can use the deposit. So that's my question, because that's I think bigger than the demand for only 19 billion.
No, you're missing the entire point. In order to buy foreign currency from the currency board, you must have base money, right? So if you're holding time deposits, you can't buy currency from the central bank with time deposits. You have to convert your time deposits into base money. Okay, so you go to your bank and you say, sorry, I want to withdraw my time deposit in cash. Okay, so your bank gives you that amount in cash, right? And now you take your cash and you hand it to the currency board. So base money has now gone down by that amount. So people can continue to do that as long as there is still base money in the system. But remember, the amount of base money is fixed. In fact, it's falling. So the more people try to convert their imposto berjangka into one primer, the less, the greater the demand for M0 rather than M2, right? Then interest rates start to rise, and the relative interest rate between Indonesia and overseas the differential becomes bigger and bigger, and eventually people say, it's too expensive for me to pay off this debt. It's too expensive for me to buy foreign exchange in terms of my borrowing costs. Right? So the relevant number is base money, not third-party liabilities. In other words, imposto berjangka, tabungan, and unexpected giro accounting. Those numbers are irrelevant because you have to convert from whatever kind of bank deposits you are holding. You have to convert to base money first. There is a fixed amount of base money, and it's precisely because it's way less than the amount of deposits in the system. Then, the more people try to convert, the more there will be big increases in interest rates, and that makes it not rational to actually try to make that conversion. Right? So you establish a new equilibrium, the interest rates move, the exchange rate will move during that transition period, but eventually it'll settle down. Okay? So your third question, talking about current Bank Indonesian policy, I think you said that Bank Indonesia has adopted a single nominal anchor, and that is because it has gone to inflation targeting. Well, maaf kalau saya bilang, that's what Bank Indonesia says, but I can often hear statements from Bank Indonesia saying, well, I think the appropriate exchange rate around about now is 11,000 or it's 12,000. Well, if you say that, then that means you've got a target for the exchange rate. And in fact, if you look at the exchange rate last year, it was stuck at around about, what was the number, 11,000 or 11,500 or something like that. And then this Bernanke shock came along, where Ben Bernanke made the obvious point that one day the US Fed would have to stop with this quantitative easing policy. Sometime or other there would have to be a shift back to more normal sort of government policy. And everybody gets all excited about this and says, oh my God, what's going to happen? We're all going to die. Now the question is, what did Bank Indonesia do about that? I think initially it was trying to stick to a fixed exchange rate, but quite quickly it said, no, we have to allow the exchange rate to move. And the exchange rate depreciated. And magically, that Bernanke crisis became not a crisis at all. Indonesia handled that potential crisis very well. Which brings me to the global financial crisis in 2008, the latter half of 2008, and the early part of 2009. The global crisis has been a terrible thing for the world economy, and yet Indonesia hardly suffered at all. Saya, what do you say, angkat topi for Bank Indonesia. Congratulations. Congratulations for Bank Indonesia. But Bank Indonesia doesn't really understand why it was so successful. Well, I've written about this in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies some time ago. What did Bank Indonesia do? It realized that you can't have two nominal anchors. So it said, well, let's allow the exchange rate to go where the market takes it, but let's keep control of interest rates or money supply. And so if you look at the money supply at that time, it was held fairly constant, steady growth rate, but the exchange rate was allowed to move. Now that was brilliant. That is exactly what was needed, and it's pretty much exactly what it did with this Bernanke crisis last year. You admit the fact that, you know, we only really have one instrument, therefore we can only control one thing. Let's accept that we can't control the exchange rate, but let's stick to controlling the money supply or the inflation rate. And Bank Indonesia was brilliantly successful with the GFC, which means that it did the right thing at that time. BE was utterly unsuccessful with handling the AFC, which means that it did the wrong things at that time. So we should learn from both of these episodes. And they both tell us the same thing. You control one nominal anchor and you don't have major problems. Okay, so it's true that at the moment you get all this talk about, oh, our current account deficit is too high. Well, I say, forget it. It's not a problem as long as you have capital inflow enough to cover that. And again, Indonesia's international reserves, they're not falling. They haven't been falling. If you find that they are falling, then just allow the exchange rate to depreciate and the process, the new equilibrium will be established very quickly. So suppose we had another Bernanke crisis. I mean, suppose America was to say tomorrow, or Europe was to say tomorrow, we're not going to do any quantitative easing anymore. We're going to tighten things up. So you know what's going to happen. Interest rates are going to rise in the rest of the world. That's going to precipitate some capital outflow from Indonesia. And people know that, and they say, oh, it's likely to cause a depreciation of the rupiah. Okay, that's all correct. But the reason for the outflow is because you're worried about the depreciation. If you allow the exchange rate to be totally flexible, then the depreciation happens immediately. In other words, it's a price adjustment. And once the depreciation has happened, then the rationale for the capital outflow is not there anymore. You're too late. You missed the bus. You made a loss already. The exchange rate has already moved. Right? So that's why, surprisingly enough, if you allow exchange rate flexibility, what you gain is capital flow stability. So that's what policymakers at this time don't seem to understand. So thank you for asking that question. That's a good question.
Okay, so do we have any other questions? We still have like 30 minutes for discussions. Yes, Donia, please.
Yoga was asking very technical question, but unlike him, I just want to pose a question about context. Sorry, my name is Pamira from Meru. My question was that Indonesia, so it also hits other Asian countries, but do the other countries also adopt this currency board system, or what do they feel about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. That's a really good question, actually. And again, I think it's disappointing to me that when people in Indonesia try to understand Indonesia's experience at that time, they don't compare Indonesia with what happened in other countries. Because as we know, there were 4 or 5 other Asian countries that had big problems at the time. Thailand was hit just as hard as Indonesia was, but also Malaysia, Korea both hit very hard. Philippines and Hong Kong were not so bad, but they were also hit a little bit. So we should be able to learn something from their experience as well as Indonesia's experience. So one answer is none of those countries adopted a currency board, but Hong Kong already had one. So we can say perhaps the currency board in Hong Kong helped Hong Kong to get through the crisis without major damage. But none of the other countries had a currency board, and none of them adopted a currency board. Okay? But I do emphasize that other countries in the world in the previous year, Bulgaria and Bosnia and Herzegovina, had adopted a currency board, and it did solve their problems. But nobody in Asia did that. But what did they do? One of the most interesting things you can do is simply to compare depreciation, inflation, and base money growth in Indonesia and those other, let's say, the other 3 countries. Let's compare it with Malaysia, Thailand, and Korea. If you look at base money growth in Indonesia compared with those other 3 countries, you will find that base money growth was much, much higher. There is no comparison. Put them all on a graph together, Indonesia is up here, the other 3 are down here. If you look at inflation, Indonesia is up here, the other 3 countries are down here. If you look at depreciation of the currency, Indonesia is up here, the other 3 countries are down there. So the policy response in Indonesia was totally different from those other countries, and my simple interpretation of that is that the other 3 countries realized the importance of having a nominal anchor for monetary policy. At that time, Indonesia had no anchor, but the other countries did have, let's say, money supply as an effective anchor. So it's a great question, and I think I encourage anybody who's interested in monetary policy to look at the data for those 3 or 4 countries at that time, and you will find that Indonesia is very much an outlier. It had a very different monetary policy, and it's for that reason that Indonesia suffered far more greatly than the other countries, in my view.
Okay, so is there any other questions?
Semuanya sudah lapar dan capek.
So I think that's going to be the end of our discussion. So thank you very much. We have a really fruitful discussion today, and thank you, Carlos, for presenting your paper. It's really interesting. As the host of the FKP for this month, I would like to inform that next week we will have another session. It will be, the topic will be on BLSM, and we will have presentations from Pak Sultan from the Semeru and also Pak Hasbina Arifin from the World Bank. So please come again next week on Wednesday.